I wasn't supposed to be at that restaurant. In fact, I almost didn't answer the call that brought me there. But that one choice, to pick up the phone, changed my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. It started like this. I was on my way home after a grueling day at work. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at the screen. It was my buddy, Dave. "Hey man, I need a favor," he said, his voice rushed. "Can you swing by Redwood Bistro and grab my jacket? I left it there after lunch with a client, and I won't make it before they close." I groaned. I didn't feel like playing errand boy, but Dave had done plenty for me over the years. Plus, the restaurant was only a few minutes out of my way. When I arrived, the bistro was buzzing. People in suits and cocktail dresses laughed over wine glasses, and the smell of grilled steak wafted through the air. I headed to the hostess stand, ready to grab the jacket and get out of there. That's when I saw her, Claire, my wife, sitting at a table in the far corner. She was leaned in close to some guy in an expensive suit, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. I couldn't see his face, but the way she laughed at whatever he just said, throwing her head back, touching her lips, hit me like a punch to the gut. My first thought, this has to be a work thing. Claire's job in PR often had her meeting clients over dinner, but something about her body language was all wrong. She was too relaxed, too engaged. It was the way she used to look at me, back when we couldn't keep our hands off each other. I stood there frozen, my brain struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. Then it happened. She reached across the table and tucked a stray strand of hair behind his ear. That's when the ground beneath me shifted. I left without saying a word. My heart was pounding so hard I couldn't think straight. The drive home was a blur. Every memory of Claire, every late-night work meeting, every moment she'd turned away from me in bed suddenly felt like a clue I should have seen. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed proof. I needed to be sure. Because if what I'd just seen was what I thought it was, then Claire was about to learn just how dangerous it is to betray someone like me. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I saw was Claire's side of the bed, neatly made, the sheets pulled tight as if she hadn't even slept there. She must have gotten up early, I thought, but the faint scent of her perfume, lingering in the air, reminded me she hadn't left without making an impression. I went downstairs to find her already dressed. She wore her usual professional attire, a sharp blazer and skirt, hair styled to perfection. Her phone was in one hand, coffee in the other, as she leaned against the kitchen counter, scrolling through her messages. "Morning," she said without looking up. "Morning," I replied, watching her carefully. "Early start today?" "Just trying to get ahead of a busy day," she said, finally glancing up with a small, practiced smile. "You know how it is." I nodded, sipping my coffee. "Late night last night?" "Yeah," she said casually. "That client meeting dragged on. I swear, some people just love to hear themselves talk." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I let the silence linger, watching for the subtle shifts in her expression. Did she seem guilty, nervous? But Claire was good, too good. If she was lying, she wasn't showing it. "What client was it?" I asked, trying to sound genuinely curious. Her hand paused mid-swipe on her phone. The hesitation was brief, but I caught it. "Oh, just someone from the new campaign," she said, her tone light. Nothing exciting. It was a lie, I knew it, and I think she knew I knew it. But instead of pressing her, I just nodded and moved on. When she kissed me goodbye a few minutes later, I stood in the doorway watching her car pull out of the driveway. My jaw tightened as I replayed her words in my head. The cracks in her story were starting to show, but I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed proof, something solid I could throw in her face when the time came. As soon as she was gone, I started my investigation. The first thing I did was head to her home office. It wasn't snooping, it was looking for answers. Claire's office was always meticulously organized, with files neatly stacked and her laptop safely locked away. I wasn't expecting to find much, but I knew I had to start somewhere. On her desk, I found a stack of invoices, most of them boring. Utility bills, subscription renewals, and the occasional shopping receipt. But then something caught my eye. A receipt from the Ivy, dated last night. 2 glasses of wine, 1 filet mignon, 1 salmon entree. I stared at the paper, my hands trembling slightly. Claire hadn't mentioned having dinner anywhere. And 2 glasses of wine? She hardly drank at all, let alone during the work week. My chest tightened as I imagined her sitting across from that man, laughing at his jokes, sipping wine like everything was fine. I folded the receipt and slipped it into my pocket. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep digging. Next, I checked her closet. It felt strange rifling through her clothes, but I needed to know if she had worn something special for her meeting. Sure enough, I found the black dress she'd been wearing at the Ivy, draped neatly over the back of a chair. I lifted it to my nose and inhaled. Her perfume was faint, but unmistakable. On the hem of the dress, there was a small smudge of lipstick, a shade she didn't wear. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my emotions in check. I wasn't going to jump to conclusions, but every new piece of evidence pushed me closer to the edge. By midday, I decided to call in a professional. I didn't trust myself to handle this alone, not without risking everything. A friend had once recommended a private investigator named Scott, someone who was discreet and reliable. I dialed his number and waited as the phone rang. "Scott speaking," came a calm voice on the other end. "I need your help," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Who's the target?" he asked. "My wife." There was a pause. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," I said firmly. Scott didn't ask any more questions. We arranged to meet that evening at a small diner on the edge of town to discuss the details. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to Claire. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be her, but the texts and emails were all routine. By the time I left the office, my nerves were shot. At the diner, Scott was already waiting for me, a notebook and pen in hand. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy with a weathered face and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "All right," he said as I slid into the booth across from him. "Tell me everything." I laid it all out, the restaurant, the dress, the late nights, and the little lies that didn't add up. Scott listened intently, jotting down notes as I spoke. "What's her usual routine?" he asked when I finished. "She leaves for work around 8 a.m. and gets home around 7 p.m. most days," I said. "But sometimes she has client meetings that run late. She says it's all work-related, but you don't believe her," Scott finished for me. "Exactly." Scott nodded, tapping his pen against the notebook. "Does she have any regular haunts? Coffee shops, restaurants, gyms?" "Not that I know of," I admitted. "But she mentioned a new campaign recently. Maybe that's connected." "I'll start with her office and work outward," Scott said. "If she's meeting someone, we'll find out who and where. You'll have updates by the end of the week." I handed him an envelope with a retainer fee, and he slid it into his jacket pocket without a word. "Don't do anything stupid," he warned before leaving. "Don't worry," I said. "I'm just gathering facts." But as I watched him walk out of the diner, I wasn't so sure. My patience was already wearing thin, and every day that passed without answers felt like torture. When Claire came home that evening, she was her usual self, calm, composed, and completely oblivious to the storm brewing around her. As we ate dinner, I studied her closely, looking for any sign of guilt. But Claire was good at hiding things. Too good. "How was your day?" I asked casually. "Busy," she replied, stabbing her fork into her salad. "But productive." "Anything interesting happen?" I pressed. "Not really," she said with a shrug. "Just meetings and paperwork." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Sounds exciting." She laughed, but it felt hollow. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the Claire I thought I knew. She was a stranger, hiding behind a mask I was determined to rip off. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Scott's investigation would take time, but I wasn't sure how long I could wait. The truth was out there, and I was going to find it, no matter what it cost me. Scott didn't take long to deliver the first update. By Wednesday evening, my phone buzzed with a text. "Got something. Meet tomorrow at the diner." The rest of the night was a blur. I paced the living room after Claire went to bed, imagining every possible scenario. What had Scott found? Was it something concrete? Or worse, was I imagining things, chasing shadows where there was nothing to see? Claire noticed my distraction the next morning. "Something on your mind?" she asked as she sipped her coffee. "Work stuff," I said quickly, avoiding her gaze. "Big deadlines coming up." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response, and went back to scrolling on her phone. But her calmness felt too deliberate, like she was trying not to give anything away. When she left for work, I waited 5 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. I couldn't concentrate on anything until I knew what Scott had found. By the time I got to the diner, he was already seated in the corner booth, a cup of coffee in front of him and a thick envelope lying on the table. "You're early," he said, smirking as I slid into the booth across from him. "What do you have?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. Scott leaned back, studying me for a moment. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" "I've been ready for days," I said firmly. He nodded and pushed the envelope across the table. "She's meeting someone," he said. "Same guy from the restaurant." My stomach twisted as I opened the envelope. Inside were a dozen photographs, each more damning than the last. The first few were mundane. Claire walking into a cafe I didn't recognize, sitting at a table near the window. Then came the man. He was tall, clean-shaven, and dressed in a sharp suit. Everything about him screamed confidence. They weren't doing anything overtly incriminating, but the body language was enough. Claire leaned toward him, her hand resting lightly on her coffee cup, her expression relaxed and animated. In one photo, his hand brushed hers across the table. In another, she laughed, her head tilted back in a way that sent my blood boiling. "These were taken over 2 days," Scott said. "She met him at that cafe on Tuesday, and again yesterday. Same time, same place." "Who is he?" I asked through clenched teeth. "Name's Brandon Cole," Scott replied. "He's a senior exec at her firm. Single, no kids, known for being friendly with the women in his office." I stared at the photos, my chest tight. I'd heard her mention Brandon in passing before, a throwaway comment about a meeting or a project. I'd never given it a second thought. "She's careful," Scott continued. They don't meet at obvious places, and there's no physical contact beyond what you see here. But the pattern is clear. What about her phone? I asked. She texts him a lot, Scott said. Mostly during work hours, but there are a few late-night messages too. Nothing explicit, but the tone is familiar. I closed the envelope and leaned back in the booth, trying to process everything. Claire wasn't just lying to me. She was building a relationship with someone else right under my nose. What do you want to do? Scott asked. I didn't answer right away. My mind was racing, weighing my options. I could confront her now, force the truth out of her, but if I did, she might find a way to turn things around, to lie her way out of it. No, I needed to be smarter than that. Keep following her, I said finally, and I need more, like something undeniable. Scott nodded. I'll keep you updated. The drive home that felt like it took hours. Every moment was consumed by thoughts of Claire and Brandon, their meetings, their conversations. I imagined the lies she must have told him about me, the secrets they'd shared over coffee. When I got home, Claire was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, but all I could think about were the photos in my car. How was your day? She asked, handing me a glass of wine. Busy, I said, forcing a smile. Yours? Same old, she replied, shrugging. Nothing exciting. I took a long sip of wine, wondering how she could lie so easily. Did she feel guilty? Did she even care? That night, as I lay awake beside her, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Scott could handle the surveillance, but I needed to see things for myself. The next day, I told Claire I had an early meeting and left the house before she did. I parked my car a few blocks from her office and waited, my heart pounding as I watched the entrance. She arrived around 8:15, looking as polished as ever. For a moment, I wondered if I was making a mistake. Maybe I was overreacting, letting my insecurities get the best of me. But then, at 12:30, she left the building. I followed her at a safe distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. She drove to the same cafe from Scott's photos, parking in a spot near the entrance. I pulled into a lot across the street, my heart racing as I watched her get out of the car. She checked her phone, adjusted her coat, and walked inside. I waited for what felt like an eternity before he showed up. Brandon. He strolled into the cafe like he owned the place, his confidence practically radiating off him. Through the window, I watched as he spotted Claire and smiled. She smiled back, that same warm, genuine smile she used to save just for me. They sat at the same table from the photos, talking and laughing as if they didn't have a care in the world. My blood boiled as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing with thoughts of what I'd do next. I sat in that car for over an hour, watching them through the cafe window. It was like a scene from a movie I never wanted to star in. Claire and Brandon looked so at ease, like they had done this 100 times before. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, punctuated by smiles and laughter. Every so often, she'd lean in closer, and he'd tilt his head just slightly, like he was hanging on her every word. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. The way she looked at him, the way I thought she used to look at me, said it all. For a moment, I considered barging in, confronting them right there in the middle of the cafe. But what would that accomplish? I didn't have proof of anything beyond what I could see, and Claire was smart. She'd twist the situation, turn it into a misunderstanding, and somehow I'd end up looking like the bad guy. No, I needed to be patient. When they finally stood to leave, my heart jumped into my throat. Claire checked her phone, probably sending some excuse to me about how she'd be working late again. Brandon held the door open for her, and they walked out together, their steps perfectly in sync. I stayed far enough behind to avoid being spotted, my car blending into the midday traffic. They didn't go far, just a short drive to a small hotel tucked away on a quiet street. My stomach churned as I watched them pull into the parking lot. Claire parked her car, and Brandon pulled into the spot beside her. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Was this it? Was this the proof I needed? They got out of their cars, exchanged a few words, and then Brandon gestured toward the hotel entrance. Claire laughed, her face lighting up in a way that made me sick to my stomach, and then they walked inside together. I sat there, frozen, as the seconds ticked by. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Was it just this guy, or were there others? And most importantly, why? It took everything I had not to storm into that hotel and demand answers. But I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed Scott. "She's at a hotel," I said as soon as he answered. There was a pause on the other end. "Alone?" "No," I said through clenched teeth. "He's with her." "Which hotel?" I gave him the address, and he promised to send someone over to confirm what was happening. "Don't do anything rash," he added before hanging up. By the time I got home that evening, Claire was already there, acting like nothing was wrong. She greeted me with a smile, her hair damp from a shower, and asked if I wanted takeout for dinner. I played along, pretending everything was normal, but every word out of her mouth felt like a lie. "How was your day?" she asked as we sat down to eat. "Busy," I replied, forcing a smile. "Yours?" "Same," she said. "Just meetings and emails all day. Nothing exciting." My blood boiled, but I kept my expression neutral. Later that night, as she slept beside me, my phone buzzed with a message from Scott. It was a photo of Claire and Brandon, taken in the lobby of the hotel. The timestamp showed they'd been there for nearly 3 hours. Confirmed, the message read. I stared at the photo, my chest tightening. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was proof. Claire was cheating on me, and she didn't even care enough to hide it well. The next morning, I left the house early, telling Claire I had another meeting. In reality, I drove to Scott's office to discuss our next steps. What do you want to do? He asked as I sat across from him. I want everything, I said. I want to know where they go, what they do, how often they meet. I need it all. Scott nodded. I can get that, but you need to be ready for what you'll find. This isn't going to get easier. I don't care, I said firmly. I need the truth. For the next few days, Scott's updates came steadily. Every day brought new details. More meetings at the cafe, more texts, and more hotel visits. Claire's excuses became more elaborate, but I stopped asking questions. I didn't need to. Her lies were unraveling on their own. One evening, she told me she'd be working late again. I kissed her goodbye and watched as she drove away, then followed her at a safe distance. Sure enough, she went straight to the cafe to meet Brandon. This time, I parked closer, angling my car so I had a clear view of their table through the window. I watched as they talked, their faces glowing with the warm light of the cafe. At one point, Brandon reached across the table and took her hand. She didn't pull away. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, fighting the urge to burst inside and end it all right there. But I knew I couldn't, not yet. When they left the cafe, I followed them to the same hotel. This time, I parked in the lot and waited, my heart pounding as the minutes stretched into hours. By the time Claire got home that night, I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. She slipped in beside me, her movements careful and quiet. I waited until her breathing slowed, then opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. The anger I felt was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, but beneath it was something else. Determination. Claire thought she could get away with this, that I'd never find out, but she was wrong. She had no idea what was coming. For the next week, I played the part of the oblivious husband. I smiled at Claire's excuses, nodded at her stories about late nights at the office, and even offered to pick up dinner a few times when she claimed to be too tired to cook. Inside, though, I was a volcano waiting to erupt. Scott's updates came in daily now, and every new piece of evidence only fueled my anger. The meetings with Brandon were becoming more frequent. It wasn't just coffee and lunch anymore. They were meeting in the evenings, too, always ending up at the same hotel. I kept telling myself I needed more time, more proof, but the truth was, I was stalling. I wasn't sure if I was ready to confront her yet. The betrayal cut deeper with every day that passed, and I wanted my revenge to be perfect. On Thursday, Scott called with news that pushed me closer to the edge. They're planning a weekend getaway, he said. I overheard them talking about it at the cafe this morning. Some cabin a couple hours north. My jaw clenched. When? This weekend, Scott replied. They're leaving Saturday morning. I sat there in silence, gripping my phone so tightly I thought it might crack. A weekend getaway? She didn't even bother to tell me she'd be gone. What do you want to do? Scott asked. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. This was my chance. If she was planning a romantic weekend with Brandon, I could catch them red-handed. No room for excuses or lies. Follow them, I said finally. Let me know exactly where they go. Scott agreed, and we ended the call. That night, Claire acted completely normal. She sat across from me at dinner, chatting about her day as if she weren't planning to spend the weekend with another man. I've got a work thing this weekend, she said casually, not even bothering to make eye contact. Some team-building retreat. I'll be gone Saturday and Sunday. I forced a smile, nodding like the clueless husband she thought I was. Sounds fun. Where's it at? Just a cabin out in the woods, she said, waving a hand dismissively. Nothing exciting. I'm sure it'll be productive, I said, keeping my voice steady. She smiled, clearly relieved that I wasn't questioning her. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, I finalized my plan. This wasn't just about catching her in the act anymore. This was about making sure she understood exactly what she'd done and ensuring she'd never forget the consequences. On Saturday morning, Claire left the house bright and early, her bag slung over her shoulder and her phone already in hand. Have a good weekend, I said, standing in the doorway as she got into her car. Thanks, she said with a quick smile. See you Sunday night. I watched her drive away, my chest tight with anger and anticipation. An hour later, Scott called with an update. They're on the road, he said, heading north on Route 17. I'm tailing them now. I grabbed my keys and left the house, driving in the same direction. Scott kept me updated along the way, giving me their location and describing the cabin when they finally arrived. It's remote, he said. No other cabins nearby. They've got the place all to themselves. Perfect. I parked my car a safe distance from the cabin and waited. From my spot on the side of the road, I could just make out the silhouette of the cabin through the trees. The lights were on, and the smoke curled from the chimney. For hours, I sat there, watching and waiting. I imagined what was happening inside. Claire and Brandon laughing, drinking wine, maybe even planning a future together. The thought made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. When the lights went out, I knew it was time to move. I grabbed the bag I'd packed the night before and made my way toward the cabin, careful to stay in the shadows. My heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I approached the porch. This was it. The night was pitch black, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the distant hum of crickets. My hands trembled slightly as I approached the cabin. But I wasn't nervous. No, this was something else. Pure raw anger mixed with determination. The cabin was modest. A single story with a wraparound porch. The windows glowed faintly from the light inside, but the curtains were drawn, offering only slivers of movement when someone passed by. Smoke still rose lazily from the chimney, and two cars were parked side by side near the driveway. Claire's sedan and Brandon's shiny black SUV. I crouched in the shadows of the trees, watching for any sign that they might come outside. The bag in my hand felt heavy, its contents carefully chosen the night before. Everything I needed to execute my plan was in there, but timing was everything. After what felt like an eternity, the lights in the cabin flickered off. Darkness swallowed the place, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight reflecting off the windows. I waited another 20 minutes, just to be sure. Then, slowly, I made my way up the gravel driveway, keeping my footsteps as silent as possible. When I reached the porch, I slipped on a pair of gloves and carefully tested the doorknob. Locked. Not that I'd expected anything less. I reached into my bag and pulled out a set of lockpicks, a skill I'd learned years ago but never thought I'd need in my own marriage. It took less than a minute to get the door open. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke, mixed with something faintly floral, Claire's perfume. My jaw clenched as I stepped inside, taking in the scene. The living room was cozy, with a plush sofa and a coffee table littered with wine glasses and an empty bottle. A single plate with crumbs sat off to the side, as if they'd shared dessert before heading to bed. I moved quietly through the room, my footsteps muffled by the thick rug. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and as I crept closer, I could hear the faint sound of breathing. Through the crack in the door, I could see them, Claire and Brandon, tangled together under the sheets. Her head rested on his chest, his arm draped possessively over her waist. They looked peaceful, content, like a couple without a care in the world. For a moment, I just stood there, my fists clenched so tightly my nails bit into my palms. The sight of them together was a dagger to the heart, but it also solidified my resolve. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a mockery of everything we'd built together. I backed away from the door and returned to the living room. From my bag, I pulled out a small camera and set it up in the corner, aimed at the bedroom door. If they woke up and came out, I'd have everything recorded. Then I moved to the kitchen, where I placed a small voice recorder under the table. This wasn't about catching them in the act anymore. I had enough proof for that. This was about control, about ensuring they could never twist the truth or deny what they'd done. Satisfied with my setup, I left the cabin as quietly as I'd entered. I didn't need to confront them tonight. That could wait. For now, the knowledge that I had everything I needed was enough. When I got back to my car, I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the cabin through the trees. My mind raced with thoughts of what was to come, of how I'd use the evidence I'd gathered to dismantle the life Claire thought she had so carefully built. By the time I drove away, the first hints of dawn were creeping over the horizon. The next morning, I called Scott. "It's done," I said. "What's the next step?" he asked. "Gather everything you have," I replied. "Photos, texts, timestamps, everything. I want it ready to use at a moment's notice." "You got it," Scott said. "And you?" "I'm going to make sure they feel this," I said. "Every last bit of it." For the rest of the day, I played the part of the dutiful husband, texting Claire to check in and even offering to pick her up when she got back. She declined, of course, claiming the team-building retreat would run late and she'd probably be too tired to talk. "Take your time," I replied, the words dripping with irony. That evening, I went through everything Scott had sent me. The photos of Claire and Brandon at the cafe, the hotel, and now the cabin. The timestamps were damning, leaving no room for excuses or explanations, but it was the texts that sealed it. Scott had managed to access some of Claire's recent messages, and what I saw made my blood run cold. "Brandon, I can't wait to spend the weekend with you. It feels like forever since I've had you all to myself." "Claire, me too. It's been so hard sneaking around, but it's worth it. You're worth it." Every word was like a knife to the chest, but it also gave me the clarity I needed. By the time Claire came home the next night, I was ready. "Hey," she said as she walked through the door, her suitcase in tow. "Miss me?" I forced a smile, my heart pounding. "Always," I said. But in reality, Her time was running out. The house felt different after Claire returned from her so-called team-building retreat. Her usual energy seemed muted, like she was carrying some unspoken guilt. She kissed me on the cheek and asked about my weekend, and I played along, giving her nothing to suspect. But inside, I was already setting the pieces in motion. For the next 2 days, I kept my distance, using work as an excuse to stay late. In reality, I was meeting with Scott and finalizing the details of my plan. The evidence we'd gathered was more than enough to destroy Claire's carefully curated life, but I didn't want to just end things. I wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal. The first step was simple: financial control. Over the years, Claire and I had built a comfortable life with joint accounts, investments, and a shared mortgage. What she didn't know was that I'd been quietly moving my assets into a separate account since the day I hired Scott. By the time I was done, the only thing left in our shared account was just enough to keep the bills paid. Next, I contacted a lawyer. I wanted the divorce papers ready to go, complete with all the evidence of her infidelity. The lawyer assured me that with the texts, photos, and timestamps, the case was airtight. Claire wouldn't just lose me, she'd lose any claim to alimony or a larger share of our assets. But that wasn't enough. I wanted Brandon to feel it too. Through Scott's connections, I learned that Brandon had a spotless reputation at work, which he relied on to maintain his position. If word got out about his relationship with a married coworker, it would be catastrophic for him. Armed with that knowledge, I started drafting an anonymous email to his HR department, attaching the most damning evidence we had. The final piece of the puzzle was psychological. Claire had lied to me for months, maybe longer, and I wanted her to experience the same confusion and betrayal I'd felt. So I started leaving small hints, just enough to make her uneasy. One night, I accidentally left my laptop open on the kitchen table with an email thread visible, a discussion with a divorce lawyer. The next day, I let her see me taking a call in hushed tones, stepping outside as soon as she walked into the room. At first, she didn't say anything, but I could tell it was getting to her. She started texting me more during the day, asking if everything was okay. She even suggested we go out for dinner, just the two of us, something she hadn't done in years. I agreed, of course, pretending that everything was fine, but in reality, I was counting down the days until the truth came crashing down around her. The night before I planned to confront Claire, I made one final move. I sent the email to Brandon's HR department, along with copies of the photos and text messages. I didn't include my name, just enough information to ensure they'd investigate. The next morning, I woke up early and watched as Claire got ready for work. She was humming to herself, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. "Have a good day," I said as she kissed me goodbye. "You too," she replied, smiling like everything was normal. As soon as she left, I called Scott. "It's time," I said. He knew exactly what I meant. I spent the day putting the final touches on my plan, making sure everything was in place. The divorce papers were ready, the email to Brandon's HR was sent, and the evidence was neatly organized in a folder labeled "The Truth." By the time Claire came home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the folder in front of me. "Hey," she said, her smile faltering when she saw the look on my face. "What's going on?" "Sit down," I said, my voice calm but firm. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the folder. "What's this about?" "You'll see," I said, sliding the folder across the table toward her. She opened it, and for a moment, her face was unreadable. Then the color drained from her cheeks as she realized what she was looking at. Photos of her with Brandon, screenshots of their texts, and a copy of the receipt from the Ivy. "I can explain," she started, her voice shaky. "Don't bother," I said, cutting her off. "I already know everything." Claire sat frozen, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages of the folder. The silence between us was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of paper. "I can explain," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Explain what?" I snapped, leaning forward. "That you've been sneaking around with Brandon? That you've lied to me every day for months? Go ahead, Claire. I'd love to hear how you spin this." Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing. Not sympathy, not regret, just a cold satisfaction watching her squirm. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "Didn't mean to hurt me?" I laughed bitterly. "You planned weekends away with him, Claire? You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed everything we built together." She opened her mouth to respond, but I raised a hand to stop her. "Didn't mean to hurt me?" I laughed bitterly. "You planned weekends away with him, Claire. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed everything we built together." She opened her mouth to respond, but I raised a hand to stop her. "Save it," I said. "I'm not here to listen to excuses. I'm here to make sure you understand exactly what you've done and what's about to happen." I reached into the folder and pulled out the divorce papers, sliding them across the table toward her. What is this?" she stammered, her eyes wide. "Your freedom," I said coldly. "You wanted to play house with Brandon? Fine, but you won't do it as my wife. Sign those papers, Claire. It's over." She stared at the papers, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't even pick up the pen. "You can't be serious," she whispered. Oh, I'm serious, I said, my tone icy. And just so you know, you're not walking away from this with anything more than what you brought into the marriage. The evidence I have guarantees that. Her head snapped up, a flicker of anger flashing in her eyes. You think you can just throw me away like this? I didn't throw you away, Claire, I said, my voice rising. You threw yourself away the second you decided Brandon was worth more than our marriage. She sat back in her chair, tears streaming down her face. What about us? What about everything we've been through together? There is no us anymore, I said firmly. You made sure of that. I stood and grabbed the folder, leaving the papers on the table. You have until tomorrow to sign them, I said as I walked toward the door. And don't even think about trying to fight this in court. You won't win. Before I could leave, she called after me. Wait, she said, her voice desperate. What about Brandon? Did you tell anyone? I turned to face her, a cold smile spreading across my lips. Why don't you ask him yourself? I said. I'm sure his HR department will be thrilled to share the details. Her face went pale, and I left the room before she could say another word. The fallout was almost immediate. The next morning, Claire called in sick to work. I knew why. She was probably trying to figure out how to salvage what little was left of her life. Meanwhile, Brandon's world was already starting to crumble. Scott called me with the news. They suspended him, he said. Apparently, the HR department took the email seriously. There's going to be a full investigation. I smiled, picturing the smug grin wiped off Brandon's face. He'd thought he could waltz into my life and take what he wanted without consequences. Now he'd learn what it felt like to lose everything. As for Claire, she spent the next few days in a state of quiet desperation. She avoided me whenever possible, her once confident demeanor replaced by something fragile and broken. On the fourth day, she finally signed the divorce papers. She left them on the kitchen counter with a note scrawled on the back of an envelope. I'm sorry. I didn't bother responding. Claire moved out a week after signing the papers. She didn't take much. Just a couple of suitcases and some personal items. As I watched her load the last of her things into her car, I felt nothing. No sadness, no anger, no relief, just emptiness. She paused before getting in, turning to face me one last time. I know you'll never forgive me, she said quietly, but I did love you. I hope you know that. I didn't reply. What was the point? As she drove away, I felt the weight of everything finally lift. The house was silent, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. It turned out he'd been involved with other coworkers, and his relationships had crossed into professional misconduct. By the time the investigation was over, he was fired and blacklisted in the industry. Claire tried to reach out to him, but it didn't last. A mutual friend told me that Brandon blamed her for everything, calling her toxic and destructive. The irony wasn't lost on me. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. I found joy in the small things again. Time with friends, a good book, a quiet evening by the fire. The scars were still there, but they no longer felt raw.